He looked at the two little boys selling broken toys in the cold, never realizing they were his sons. And one of them was dying. He wasn't looking for anyone. Not that morning, not in that town, and certainly not in front of a grocery store where two boys no older than 8 were sitting on an overturned milk crate, their gloved hands cupped around steaming paper cups and a cardboard sign that read, "Toys for sale. Help, Mom." Ethan Walker. A man whose days were carved by schedules and silence paused, not because he needed toys, but because something in the stillness of that scene refused to let him pass. One boy had a missing button on his coat and a plastic dinosaur with a chipped tail. The other held out a wooden truck so carefully as if it might break his heart to let it go. How much? Ethan asked the question foreign in his throat. The boys looked up, hopeful eyes wide. "Anything you can give, sir." He reached for his wallet, unaware that in that moment, beneath a gray Kentucky sky, between a child's trust and a stranger's hesitation, his life, long abandoned and buried beneath guilt, was about to open a door he thought forever closed. The wind in Hollow Creek that morning carried the bite of winter through every crack and crevice of the small Kentucky town. Storefronts were dusted with frost, and smoke curled lazily from chimneys, rising into a pale gray sky that promised snow by sundown. Most people hurried along the sidewalks, their boots crunching over salted patches of ice collars, upturned eyes downcast. But Ethan Walker wasn't most people. He was passing through, technically. A short detour on his way to Nashville, where meetings, contracts, and a hotel suite with too many mirrors awaited. He didn't expect to stop in Hollow Creek, and he certainly didn't expect to see them. Two boys no older than 7 or 8 sat hunched on a plastic milk crate outside the faded grocery store, their breath fogging the air in soft little clouds. One held a battered toy dinosaur in his lap, the other a hand-painted wooden truck with a broken wheel. In front of them, a piece of torn cardboard with big letters spelled, "Selling our toys. Please help our mom." Ethan slowed. Something about them, something still and unspoken, pulled him from the warmth of his car and into the open chill. He didn't speak at first. The older boy looked up, wary but brave. "Hi, sir," he said. "You want to buy something?" Ethan looked down at the toys, then at their mismatched gloves, their too thin coats. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Not yet. In that moment, he didn't know their names, their story, or what they were about to change in him, but he knew one thing with painful clarity: he couldn't walk away. Ethan Walker had built his life on logic, clean numbers and clean exits. A mid-level executive turned successful logistics consultant, he was the kind of man who booked flights 2 months in advance and never left voicemail messages. His life was neat, functional, and utterly detached. So when his GPS rerouted him through Hollow Creek, due to a highway closure, he intended to stop only for gas and coffee, nothing more. But as he pulled into the modest parking lot of McKinley's Market, he caught sight of something that didn't belong in the rhythm of his day 2 young boys crouched beneath the overhang by the entrance. Their cheeks flushed from the cold, their hands gripping worn-out toys as if they were treasures. One held up a handmade wooden truck with chipped red paint. The other cradled a plastic dinosaur with a cracked tail. In front of them, a sign scrawled in uneven handwriting on the back of a cereal box read, "Toys for sale. Trying to help Mom." Ethan stood frozen for a beat, his coffee order forgotten. There was something unbearably earnest in the way the older boy Noah lifted the toy and looked at him. Not with pity, not with expectation, but with quiet dignity. As though he wasn't asking for charity, but offering something of value. Caleb, the younger one, clutched his dinosaur tighter and watched silently, eyes dark and observant. Ethan took a step closer, then another, unsure of what compelled him. Maybe it was the cold. Maybe it was the boy's stillness. Or maybe it was something he hadn't felt in years. A pull toward a life that was messy, real, and suddenly impossible to ignore. Ethan hadn't planned on speaking, but something in the way the older boy Noah, he would later learn, lifted the wooden truck with such care made silence impossible. He crouched slowly, eye level now, pretending to study the toy, but really watching their faces. Caleb, the younger one, leaned in slightly, eyes wide beneath a too small knit cap. Ethan cleared his throat. "How much for the truck?" he asked, voice rougher than he expected. Noah shrugged with practiced maturity. Anything you can give, sir. We're trying to help. Ethan looked down at the cardboard sign again, then back at their shoes. One of Caleb's had a hole near the toe stuffed with tissue. Help with what he asked, gently, already knowing the answer. Caleb spoke this time, his voice barely louder than the wind curling around the corner of the building. Mom's sick. We don't got much food left. And then Noah's voice followed, low and sincere, with a tremble that cut through every shield Ethan had built in his life. Please, mister, can you buy one? We're saving up to get dinner for her. She hasn't eaten since yesterday. For a second the world slowed. Ethan felt something inside him ache, not pity, not even guilt, but recognition. A long-forgotten version of himself barefoot on a cracked porch step, watching his own mother pretend not to be hungry. He reached for his wallet, fingers trembling slightly, not just from the cold. The bills he pulled out felt heavier than they should have, not because of their amount, but because of what they were about to mean. Not a transaction, but the start of something that would undo everything he thought he knew about who he was and who he was meant to be. Ethan hesitated for a moment, then opened his wallet and pulled out 3 crisp $20 bills, handing them over with a quiet, "I'll take everything." Noah's eyes widened, not in greed, but in disbelief, as if kindness at that scale didn't fit into the world he knew. Caleb clutched the dinosaur tightly, as if unsure whether to let go. Ethan smiled gently and nodded. "It's yours, kid. I'm just keeping it safe." The boys placed the toys into a plastic grocery bag with careful hands, as if handling gold. Noah whispered a soft thank you, and Ethan nodded again, then turned and walked briskly toward his rental car, the bag swinging from his hand, the wind picking up around him. But something in his chest tightened with each step. He had done the right thing, he told himself that over and over, but as he reached the driver's side door and opened it, the voices of the boys stayed with him, echoing under his ribs. She hasn't eaten since yesterday. He gripped the steering wheel, staring through the windshield at nothing. Around him the town moved on, people shopping, laughing, driving, but he felt detached from it all, as if he had stepped out of one world and into another, colder one. The toys sat in the bag on the passenger seat, silent witnesses to a moment that refused to leave him alone. He started the car, pulled out of the lot, and drove 2 blocks before stopping again, his heart beating louder than the engine. The money wasn't enough. Buying toys wouldn't fix hunger. And for the first time in years, Ethan Walker found himself circling back, not because he had to, but because walking away now felt like abandoning a piece of himself he didn't know was still alive. The next morning, before the sun had fully burned through the frost, Ethan Walker pulled into the same grocery store lot with 2 cups of hot chocolate in a cardboard tray and a knot of uncertainty in his stomach. He had told himself it was just a kind gesture, a way to follow through, nothing more. But as he spotted the 2 boys sitting on the same overturned crate, bundled in the same threadbare coats, something deeper stirred. He parked farther away. This time, approached quietly, and said nothing, as he lowered himself onto the cold concrete just a few feet from them. The boys looked over, startled at first, until Noah recognized him and nudged Caleb gently. Ethan didn't offer explanations, didn't try to break the silence too quickly. Instead, he held out the tray, letting the steam rise between them like a peace offering. "It's not much," he said, "but it's warm." Noah reached out first, his fingers red from the cold, wrapping around the cup slowly, as if unsure it was real. Caleb followed, more cautious, his wide eyes studying Ethan's face with a mix of curiosity and something else, hope maybe, or suspicion worn soft from too much disappointment. They sipped in silence, the kind of silence that feels oddly full. Ethan didn't press them for answers. He didn't ask about their mother or why no adult had come for them. He just sat there, a man in a long coat with tired eyes, sharing a morning with 2 boys who hadn't asked for help, but had quietly accepted it. And in that stillness, beneath a sky that was beginning to brighten, something began to shift. Not in the world, not yet, but inside him. A crack, a stir, a thaw. After a few minutes passed and the cups were nearly empty, Ethan turned slightly toward the boys, his voice quiet, almost tentative. "Does your mom know you 2 are out here?" The question hung in the cold air like breath, visible and fragile. Caleb looked down quickly, his small hands tightening around the cup, while Noah's jaw shifted an instinctive, almost imperceptible reaction, like someone used to guarding a truth too heavy for his age. Ethan didn't press, but his gaze stayed steady, not demanding, just waiting. Finally, Noah answered, his voice low, and practiced like he'd had to explain things to adults before, and learned that fewer words meant fewer problems. She's resting. She gets really tired now. There was no bitterness in his tone, only an ache that shouldn't belong to a child. Caleb glanced up, cheeks flushed, and added, "She had a fever last night. We didn't want to wake her." Ethan nodded slowly, digesting the weight behind their words. This wasn't some childish adventure. This was survival wrapped in routine responsibility no child should carry. He leaned back against the brick wall, processing it all. "So you came here alone?" Noah nodded. "We've done it before. People don't really notice." Ethan exhaled a soft breath, filled with frustration and something deeper, remorse maybe. Not for something he'd done, but for being the kind of man who until now wouldn't have noticed either. He looked at the boys again, truly looked, and in that moment something shifted. The question he'd asked wasn't about blame, it was the start of responsibility. He wasn't their father. He wasn't anyone to them. But now that he knew, walking away would feel like betrayal. Noah looked down at his half-empty cup, fingers wrapped tightly around it as if the heat might anchor him, then lifted his eyes just enough to meet Ethan's. His voice came soft, almost like a confession. "She knows," he said. "But she's sick. She can't come outside anymore." The way he said it, without drama, without pleading, hit Ethan harder than if the boy had cried. It wasn't just a statement. It was a truth this child had lived with long enough to fold into his daily understanding of the world. Caleb nodded beside him. His lips chapped, his nose red, but his face set with the same kind of quiet acceptance, the kind that only comes when life stops offering better options. "She used to walk us here," Noah added after a pause, staring at the sidewalk like it held the memory. "But last week she couldn't stand up. We told her we could do it." Ethan felt his throat tighten, the weight of those words digging into places he'd long sealed shut. These boys weren't just poor or cold or brave. They were carrying a kind of invisible grief, a day-to-day endurance that shouldn't belong to anyone so small. And suddenly the toys yesterday, the chocolate today, they felt like bandages over a wound that went far deeper. He wanted to ask more about the mother, about how long this had been going on, about what they did when she got worse, but he didn't want to push too fast. Instead, he looked at Noah and said quietly, "You told her you'd take care of things, didn't you?" Noah nodded, his chin trembling for just a second before he steadied it. "She said, we're strong. She said we're all she's got." From that morning forward, something shifted in Ethan Walker, not outwardly, not in any grand or visible way, but in the quiet decisions that began to anchor his days. He didn't tell himself he was getting involved. He didn't call it charity or redemption or even kindness. He simply told himself he was going to check on the boys, make sure they were okay. That was all. But each morning, as the frost clung to the windows of Hollow Creek and the breath of townspeople fogged the air, Ethan found himself returning to that same corner near the grocery store, with a thermos of hot chocolate or a brown paper bag with 2 warm muffins, or a set of gloves he told them he had lying around. The boys never asked for more. They never complained. They only accepted these small offerings with the kind of gratitude that made Ethan ache, not because they were needy, but because they were proud, and every quiet thank you carried the weight of children trying to be older than they were. He stayed near, not always talking, sometimes sitting on the curb across from them with his phone in hand or pretending to read a newspaper he didn't care about, but always within earshot, always watching. It wasn't just about them anymore. It was about something in him, waking up a part of his soul that had gone cold over the years, stirred back to life by 2 boys selling forgotten toys with cracked buttons and missing wheels. Ethan didn't know what he was becoming to them, or what they were becoming to him, but he knew this. He couldn't pretend not to see them anymore. It took Ethan 3 days to find the house. He hadn't asked the boys directly. Something about their pride made him hold back, but he paid attention. The direction they walked, the corner they always turned, the alley with the faded mural. It was a neighborhood he hadn't driven through in years, the kind people like him usually passed by without looking. But there it was, a sagging single-story rental tucked behind a shuttered laundromat on the east side of Hollow Creek. The paint on the siding was peeling, one of the windows was taped over with plastic, and the porch light dangled by a wire like it had long since given up. He stood there for a long moment, uncertain. Then he knocked. It wasn't Noah or Caleb who answered, it was her, Rachel. She looked younger than he'd expected, maybe early 30s, but worn in a way time couldn't fully explain. Her eyes were tired, framed by dark circles that told a story of sleepless nights and quiet suffering, but they were alert, cautious, assessing him the way a mother protects her last line of defense. She didn't smile. "Can I help you?" Her voice was soft but steady, the kind that had learned not to waste breath. Ethan cleared his throat. "Hi, I'm Ethan Walker. I've seen your boys around. I just wanted to check in." A long pause followed, and for a moment he thought she might close the door. But instead she stepped aside. Inside, the air was warm but stale, scented faintly of Vicks and boiled potatoes. Papers cluttered the coffee table, and in the corner, a laptop blinked beside a stack of folded towels. On the couch, a dialysis machine hummed quietly. Ethan's eyes flicked to it, then back to her. She saw it. "I do what I can from home," she said, gesturing to the laptop. "I used to clean houses. Now I transcribe. Pays pennies, but it keeps us going." Her voice didn't shake. But Ethan felt something inside him crack. This wasn't just about two boys selling toys anymore. This was about a mother fighting to stay alive for them. As Ethan stepped further into the small living room, brushing snow from his coat and trying not to stare too long at the quiet signs of hardship, the cracked vinyl floor, the second-hand space heater, the chipped coffee mug holding pencils, Rachel sat down slowly, as if her body bore more weight than its frame should. For a moment, they didn't speak. And then something passed between them. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was real. Rachel's eyes, a shade of deep chestnut worn thin by years of fatigue, locked onto his face with a stillness that made the air feel heavier. She blinked once, and then again. Her breath caught, but she didn't let it show. The recognition didn't explode, it burned slowly, steadily, like an ember long buried. She knew him. Not just from town, not from some charity gala or news article. She knew him. Ethan felt it too, the subtle shift, the unspoken question hovering in the silence. His face hadn't changed all that much since they were young. His eyes still held that same sharpness, though, now dulled by loss and regret. And her gaze in that moment saw through the tailored coat, the polished shoes, the awkward kindness, straight to the boy who once made a promise he didn't keep. She didn't say his name. She didn't accuse him. But the pain in her eyes said enough. It said, "You left." It said, "I remember." And still, she said nothing. Instead, she glanced toward the back room where a blanket fluttered in the draft. "They'll be back soon," she murmured, her voice calm, but carrying something ancient and unsaid. Ethan nodded slowly, unsure if he should apologize, explain, confess. But how do you explain 17 years of silence? How do you face the woman you walked away from, the boys you never knew were yours? Without shattering, Rachel looked away first, clearing her throat as she pulled the blanket tighter over her lap. The silence didn't close the distance between them, but it didn't widen it either. It simply was a quiet reckoning, waiting for the truth to finally speak. Ethan didn't try to force a conversation, didn't ask questions he had no right to, didn't press against the walls Rachel had every reason to keep up. He simply stood there for a moment longer, the weight of 1,000 unspoken words thick in his throat, then slowly lowered the grocery bag he had carried all the way from the car. It wasn't much, some fruit-canned soup rice, peanut butter, a small bottle of pain reliever, and 2 boxes of herbal tea, but it was what he could do without crossing a line. As he set the bag gently on the kitchen counter, careful not to make too much noise in the stillness of the house, he noticed the way her hands trembled slightly as she pulled her sweater tighter over her chest. She didn't stop him, didn't ask what he was doing, didn't thank him, but she didn't stop him. That was enough. In that moment, it was all he could hope for. He wanted to say something kind, something that would make the air less heavy, but the words died in his mouth before they reached his lips. What could he say? That he was sorry, that he didn't know, that he saw them, really saw them now and couldn't look away anymore. None of it felt like enough. So he offered only a gentle nod and stepped toward the door. As his hand touched the knob, Rachel's voice came quietly, almost inaudibly behind him. "The boys don't know." He turned slightly, eyes soft, but she didn't elaborate. She just stared at the floor as if the truth weighed too much to carry aloud. Ethan gave a slight, respectful bow of his head, then quietly opened the door and stepped back into the winter air. The cold slapped him like a reckoning, but he welcomed it. The silence of the house lingered in his bones as he walked down the path, the light from the window casting long shadows behind him. He didn't know what came next, but for the first time in years, Ethan Walker knew he couldn't keep walking away. 10 years ago, the air in Hollow Creek still smelled like promise. It was late summer, the kind of season that made even broken things feel golden for a while. Ethan had returned to town on a short visit, a weekend escape from the weight of city boardrooms and impossible expectations, not intending to stay, not intending to feel anything real. But then he saw her, Rachel, with her hair tucked behind her ears, laughter spilling out like it didn't owe anyone anything, and eyes that carried stories she never told. They met at a local fundraiser, an awkward gathering at the town library where plastic cups of lemonade stood in for champagne. Ethan had spoken on behalf of some business scholarship, said a few too polished words, but it was Rachel who stayed behind to clean up, who spoke plainly, who challenged his rehearsed charm without ever raising her voice. That night they ended up on the hood of his rental car, under a sky full of stars, sharing stories about who they used to be before life got complicated. One evening became 2, then 3. They weren't in love, not yet, maybe not ever. But there was something undeniable, a stillness between them that felt like relief. They shared a brief, breathless connection in the quiet dark of her apartment, where laughter turned to whispers, and whispers turned to silence. When Ethan left that Monday morning, he didn't promise to call. He told himself it was better that way, that nothing real had happened, that she'd be fine. He didn't know she had already started to feel sick. He didn't know she would take 3 buses to a clinic where the nurse's face turned solemn. He didn't know she would hold the test in her hand and whisper his name like a question no one would ever answer. Rachel never tried to find him, and Ethan never looked back. He returned to board meetings and deadlines, and the illusion of control, unaware that a life, 2 lives were quietly beginning without him. Until now. Until those boys with eyes like his sitting in the cold selling pieces of their childhood to buy dinner for the woman he had once left behind. Rachel sat on the edge of her narrow bed that night, the test still clutched in her hand, its lines clear and undeniable. The room was dark, except for a weak lamp flickering on the nightstand, casting a glow over stacks of bills and half-folded laundry. Her heart beat too fast, but her breath came slow, deliberate, as if trying to absorb the gravity of what had just begun. She thought of Ethan not with anger, not yet, but with a kind of aching detachment, as though he already belonged to a different world, one where things like responsibility and permanence didn't quite exist. She didn't cry. She didn't panic. She just sat there, letting the quiet wash over her, letting the word mother press itself slowly into her bones. In the days that followed, she didn't tell anyone. Not her neighbor. Not her sister who lived 3 states away. And certainly not Ethan. She told herself he had made his choice the moment he walked away without asking for her number. He had offered her nothing to hold on to, no thread, no tether, not even a goodbye that sounded like it meant something. So she made a choice of her own. She chose to keep the baby. Later she would discover there were 2. A whisper of surprise at her second ultrasound, followed by a weary smile from the nurse who said, "You're going to need twice the strength." Rachel laughed then, soft and sad because strength was all she had left. There were nights when she considered writing him just so the children would someday know who he was, but every time she sat down with pen in hand, silence felt safer. She got a job packing boxes from home. She learned to budget with precision. She learned how to rock two crying babies in the same pair of arms and how to fall asleep to the sound of need. And most of all, she learned how to build a life from nothing but determination and love. Ethan Walker faded into memory like a name on a page you never finish reading. The boys never asked, and Rachel never offered. Some truths she thought belonged to time, not to words. Rachel stood by the small window of their kitchen, her thin fingers curled around a chipped mug of lukewarm tea she had forgotten to drink. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, soft and relentless, covering the cracked pavement like a quiet promise of forgetting. Inside, the heater hummed low, barely enough to warm the room, but her eyes weren't on the cold. They were on Noah and Caleb curled up together on the couch, sharing a single blanket, giggling over a picture book they had long outgrown but still loved. Their laughter echoed lightly in the corners of the house, filling it with something that almost felt like hope. Rachel's chest tightened. She had raised them on her own for nearly a decade through sickness, through silence, through nights when the lights had gone out, and mornings when all she had to offer for breakfast was dignity wrapped in toast. They were hers entirely. Every scraped knee, every school project, every lullaby half sung through exhaustion. And yet now, with Ethan's sudden reappearance, his familiar voice, his eyes that mirrored Caleb's, his hands that once brushed hers like a promise, everything she had tightly held began to tremble. She didn't know what he wanted. She didn't know what he knew. She had built walls not out of spite but out of necessity, and now those walls were cracking under the weight of a past she thought she had buried beneath laundry and rent notices and long nights praying for strength. She looked at her boys again, their hair messy, their socks unmatched, their joy unshaken, and whispered to herself, more than to them, "If one day your father comes back, I don't know what I'll do." The words hung in the room invisible but heavy like breath in cold air. She wanted to protect them, to shield their innocence from the man who had walked away before he even knew their names. But something inside her knew the day was coming when the past would no longer stay quiet. Ethan began to show up, not with grand gestures, but with the kind of quiet, steady presence that children remember, and adults don't know how to trust at first. It started with a knock on the door one cold morning, a rusted toolbox in his hand, and a gentle, almost awkward, "You said the pipes were acting up." Rachel stood in the doorway, wary but tired, and let him in. He crawled under the sink, tightening old bolts, replacing worn-out tubing, his once manicured hands stained with rust and effort. The next day, he brought the correct medication Rachel couldn't afford, slipping the brown paper bag onto the kitchen counter without a word. She didn't ask how he knew what she needed. He didn't explain. Then came the rides to school. Noah and Caleb would run out backpacks, swinging their cheeks pink from the cold as they climbed into the back of Ethan's old truck, the heater blasting and the dashboard covered in small candies he had started bringing just for them. They began calling him Mr. Ethan, then just Ethan. And one day, without prompting Dad, Rachel heard it through the cracked window one morning and sat down hard at the kitchen table, breath stolen. Ethan didn't correct them. He simply smiled and nodded, his voice catching, as he said, "Let's go, boys." He started showing up after school, too, helping with homework. He barely understood, pretending to remember the multiplication tables, praising every stick figure drawing with the reverence of a museum curator. Rachel, who had learned to do everything alone, didn't know how to accept help. But slowly, day by day, she began to leave the door unlocked when she knew he might come. She still didn't trust him with her heart, but she had to admit he was earning something deeper. Not forgiveness, not yet, but presence. And presence, as she had come to learn, was the beginning of everything. The days blurred into a soft rhythm, one Ethan never knew he needed until he found himself rearranging meetings just to make it back to Hollow Creek in time to walk Noah and Caleb home from school. The boys, once shy and cautious, now ran to him with the wild abandon only children who've tasted abandonment can reclaim through new hope. They called him Uncle Ethan, At first voices unsure, but curious, testing the safety of the name like a hand reaching toward warmth. But over the next few weeks, that title grew roots, spoken with more ease, then with joy, and sometimes with mischief as they tugged at his sleeve or asked for just one more push on the swing. Ethan didn't know when the shift happened, but he realized it had taken place the night Caleb fell asleep on his shoulder during a thunderstorm, trusting him to be a shelter. Noah, the older one, more watchful and quiet, began asking questions about tools, about fixing things, about how to drive, and Ethan for once felt useful, not in boardrooms or headlines, but in the act of patiently answering a child who cared. They played board games in the cramped living room with missing pieces replaced by buttons. Ethan helped them with their reading, fumbled through fractions, and read bedtime stories in a voice he didn't recognize. Softer, slower, like someone trying to heal something broken without drawing attention to the cracks. Rachel watched from the doorway, sometimes arms crossed but eyes unreadable, as if trying to decide whether to believe what was unfolding before her eyes. But the boys didn't hesitate. In their world, Ethan had entered not as a ghost from the past, but as a man who showed up when it mattered. They didn't know the full story, and maybe they didn't care. They only knew that when they were cold, he brought warmth. When they were scared, he stayed. And when they called for Uncle Ethan, he answered. Every single time. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon, the kind where the sky hung low and gray over Hollow Creek, and a light drizzle tapped gently against the window panes of Rachel's modest kitchen. Ethan was seated at the worn wooden table, helping Caleb assemble a small model airplane kit they'd picked up from the thrift store over the weekend. The boy was focused, tongue slightly out, brows furrowed with concentration as he tried to snap a wing into place. Noah was napping on the couch, an open library book across his chest, and Rachel was in the other room resting after her latest dialysis session. The silence felt comforting, natural, like a family caught in an unspoken rhythm. Then Caleb looked up, his small fingers still holding a plastic part, and asked in the softest voice, "Uncle Ethan, do you have kids?" The question landed like a stone in Ethan's chest. His hands paused, mid-motion, eyes fixed on the airplane, though he no longer saw it. He opened his mouth slightly, but no words came out. A dozen images flashed through his mind, his younger self walking away. Rachel's tear-stained face in that hospital hallway. He never returned to the two boys selling toys in the cold. Rachel's breathless voice that first day he returned. He swallowed hard, the knot in his throat tightening. Caleb blinked up at him, wide-eyed and innocent, waiting. Ethan managed a shaky smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "That's a good question," he murmured, voice almost hoarse. He gently placed the wing down and ruffled Caleb's hair, buying time. "Let's finish this first, okay?" Caleb nodded, not pressing, sensing something beneath the silence that his young mind couldn't yet name. Ethan turned back to the model hands, steady again, but his heart wasn't. The question lingered in the air like unfinished music. And for the first time, Ethan felt the weight of truth, not just as a memory, but as a decision he would soon have to make. It happened just after sunrise on a bitterly cold morning when Ethan arrived at Rachel's house to drop off groceries and found her collapsed on the bathroom floor, pale and barely conscious. Panic surged through him like electricity as he rushed to her side, calling her name, gently shaking her shoulders. Her breathing was shallow, her lips slightly bluish, and the boys, still in their pajamas, stood frozen in the hallway, with fear in their eyes. Without hesitation, Ethan scooped Rachel into his arms, wrapped her in a blanket, and carried her to his truck, whispering reassurances to the boys that everything would be okay, even though he wasn't sure himself. The drive to Hollow Creek Medical Center was a blur of red lights and anxious glances, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Once inside, the ER staff sprang into action, wheeling Rachel into a room, asking rapid-fire questions. Ethan struggled to answer her medical history, insurance, emergency contact. He realized in that moment just how much he didn't know. A nurse placed a clipboard in his hands. "We need a responsible adult to authorize care," she said firmly. "Is she married?" Any family, Ethan's heart pounded. He looked at the form, at the blank space where emergency contact and primary decision-maker were supposed to go. The boys needed their mother. Rachel needed someone to stand in the gap. And he couldn't walk away again. Slowly, he took the pen, hands trembling slightly, and signed his name, Ethan Walker. Relationship to patient. He paused, then wrote guardian. A quiet weight settled over him, not just legal, but moral. Rachel's life now depended on decisions he would make. As the doctors moved forward, as the machines beeped and the curtain closed around her fragile body, Ethan sat outside, clutching the clipboard, feeling the invisible lines of the past, the present, and the future converge in that cold waiting room chair. While Rachel lay unconscious in the sterile stillness of the hospital room, her breathing shallow beneath tubes and beeping monitors, Ethan sat beside her in silence, holding her cold hand in his. The fluorescent lights cast a clinical glow, but his mind was far from the hospital he was drifting back to. Every moment he had missed, every choice he had buried under the weight of ambition and fear. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts as a nurse stepped in quietly, holding a manila folder. "Mr. Walker," she said gently, "we found some old documents in her file. It might help if you're stepping in for her care decisions." He took the folder, hesitantly unsure what he was about to see, and opened it with a sense of reverence, as if the contents might break something already fragile. Medical records, notes, a few prescriptions dated years back, and then tucked between two sheets a pair of birth certificates. His hands froze. Two names stared back at him: Noah Walker and Caleb Walker. Date of birth exactly 9 years ago. Mother Rachel Bennett. Father unknown. The word sliced through him. 3 syllables that carried decades of absence. He traced his fingers slowly over the word unknown, as if by touching it he could erase it, rewrite it, reclaim it. But he hadn't been there. He hadn't known. Or maybe he had known deep down that night all those years ago wasn't just another fleeting chapter. He stared at the identical dates, at the blank space where his name should have been, and something inside him crumbled, not out of guilt alone, but out of love, aching, urgent love. These boys weren't just Rachel's. They were his blood, his silence, his sons. He closed the folder slowly, pressing it to his chest as if trying to absorb the weight of it, and looked back at Rachel's still face. "You did it all alone," he whispered, "and I didn't even know." But now he did, and nothing would ever be the same again. Ethan sat alone in the corner of the hospital cafeteria, the envelope heavy in his trembling hands. The room was full of movement, nurses hurrying past machines, whirring in the background, families whispering around plastic tables. But to Ethan, everything was silent, suspended in the space between not knowing and the truth. He stared at the envelope for what felt like hours, the name of the lab printed neatly on the front, the results sealed inside. He had ordered the DNA test 3 days ago, unable to sleep, unable to breathe under the weight of uncertainty. He had taken a quiet swab of the boys' used utensils left from lunch at the apartment and mailed the sample without telling anyone. It wasn't about doubting anymore. It was about needing to be sure, about needing something concrete to hold on to after years of letting go. With a deep breath, he tore it open and unfolded the paper slowly. His eyes scanned quickly until they landed on the line that would change everything. Probability of paternity 997%. A rush of heat flushed through his chest. He blinked, reading the sentence again and again, his hands growing cold even as the truth seared itself into him. He was their father. Not metaphorically, not out of guilt or emotional bond, biologically, legally, undeniably. The boys he had watched sell broken toys in the snow, the boys who called him Uncle Ethan with innocent trust, were his own flesh and blood. Ethan swallowed hard, the paper shaking in his grip, as 1,000 memories he didn't have crashed into his mind. First steps, scraped knees, bedtime stories. He never told birthdays, missed year after year. Regret stabbed deep, but beneath it bloomed something else, a resolve he hadn't known he possessed. He folded the paper carefully, placed it back into the envelope, and held it to his chest the way he had held the birth certificates. They were his sons, his, and he would never let them face another winter alone. The hospital room was dimly lit by the soft glow of a lamp in the corner, casting gentle shadows across the pale blue walls. Machines hummed in a quiet rhythm beside the bed, and the scent of antiseptic lingered faintly in the air. Ethan sat slouched in the chair next to Rachel's bed, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped tightly, eyes fixed on her face. He hadn't left that spot since the moment they'd wheeled her out of emergency surgery. Her breathing was steadier now, the color slowly returning to her cheeks, and though the doctor said the worst had passed, Ethan had learned not to trust peace too quickly. His heart had been racing nonstop since the moment he opened that envelope, since the truth shattered every wall he had spent a decade building. Now he wasn't sure if he was more afraid of the truth or of what it meant for them, for her, for the boys, for the time they had lost. Rachel stirred slightly, her lashes fluttering before her eyes opened just enough to find him. Her voice came out like a breath, thin and cracked but unmistakable. "You know, don't you?" The question hung in the air like mist, not demanding an answer so much as confirming everything already laid bare. Ethan's chest tightened, emotions surging through him like a wave he couldn't contain. He nodded slowly, his throat too full to speak at first, then leaned closer, his voice a whisper. "Yes, I know." Rachel didn't cry. She simply closed her eyes again, a single tear slipping from the corner down the curve of her cheek. "I wanted to tell you," she said quietly, pain threading through her words, "but I was scared. You were gone, and I didn't know if you'd ever look back." Ethan reached for her hand, taking it gently, his grip firm with the promise that he would never walk away again. "I'm here now," he said, his voice hoarse. "I'm not going anywhere." In that fragile moment, amidst the beeping monitors and the soft rustle of hospital linen, silence wrapped around them like truth. Neither forgiveness nor blame was spoken, but something heavier, older, and more human passed between them, a quiet beginning. Ethan looked down at Rachel's frail hand resting in his palm, the weight of a decade pressing against the silence between them. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind ever since the DNA results came back, but nothing in that sterile envelope could prepare him for the raw humanity of this conversation, for the way her eyes, though tired, still searched his face for something deeper than acknowledgement. And then he spoke, his voice low, steady, but edged with a tremor only the heart could produce. "But I already chose them, Rachel. I chose them before I knew they were mine." The words didn't come with pride or accusation. They came with truth, the kind that had carved its way into his bones over the past few weeks, ever since that bitter winter morning when he saw two small boys selling old toys outside a grocery store. Their cheeks flushed from the cold, their voices too polite, too practiced for children. He had felt something shift inside him that day, before the questions, before the paperwork, before the hospital and the history they had already made space in his life, where walls had once been. "I saw them." He continued, his eyes still on her hand, "and I couldn't walk away. I didn't know why then. I just knew I couldn't. I brought them hot chocolate, I took them to school. I fixed the sink because it was leaking. But none of that was because I owed anything. It was because something about them, about you, made me stop running." He paused, and when he looked up, Rachel's eyes were wet again. But this time it wasn't just pain, it was something like release. Finding out they're mine, it doesn't change how I feel. It only explains it. He reached to brush a loose strand of hair from her forehead. "You didn't give me their names. Life did. And even if the results had been different, I would have stayed. Because I had already chosen them, Rachel. I chose to love them before I ever knew the truth." Rachel's lips trembled as she turned her face slightly toward him, her eyes glassy and wide, holding back a storm that had been building for years. The soft hospital sheets clung loosely to her frame, making her look smaller than he remembered, more fragile. And yet in that moment, there was a strength in her gaze that pierced through everything Ethan had armored himself with. Her voice came out quiet, almost like a breath escaping her chest, but it landed with the weight of everything unspoken between them. "Don't leave again." The words weren't dramatic. They weren't shouted or begged. They were whispered with the kind of desperation that only someone who had spent too many nights alone watching the door that never opened could carry. It was a plea shaped by years of silence, of carrying children alone through sickness and joy, of listening for a knock that never came. Ethan didn't answer right away. His heart cracked at the rawness of her voice, at the tear that slid from the corner of her eye and down toward the pillow. He watched her blink slowly, and he realized she wasn't asking for fairy tales or promises wrapped in poetry. She was asking for presence. For someone who wouldn't disappear when life became inconvenient. For a man who wouldn't vanish when things got real, when kids needed shoes, or when the sink leaked again, or when medical bills piled higher than sleep. "I won't," he said finally, his voice low and tight with emotion, every syllable trembling under the weight of regret and newfound resolve. "I'm not that man anymore, Rachel." Her fingers curled around his without hesitation, this time weak but certain, and for the first time since he'd sat by her bedside, she closed her eyes not from pain, but from rest, as if something deep inside her had finally unclenched. Ethan didn't let go. He wouldn't, because this time, when she asked him to stay, he had an answer not just in words, but in who he had become, a man who had finally stopped running. Ethan sat across from Noah and Caleb in the small living room that had come to feel more like home than any of his luxury condos ever had. The air was quiet still, as if the room itself were holding its breath. The boys had paused their drawing on the coffee table, both looking up with wide, curious eyes that mirrored Rachel's in ways Ethan could now never unsee. He rubbed his hands together nervously, trying to steady his voice, knowing that once he said what he was about to say, there would be no taking it back. "Hey, guys," he began, offering a soft smile. "I have something really important to tell you. It's a big thing, and I've been trying to find the right time, but I think you deserve to know now." Caleb tilted his head slightly, sensing the seriousness in Ethan's tone, while Noah sat up straighter, clutching the edge of the couch cushion. Ethan took a deep breath and continued. "Do you remember when you asked me if I had any kids, and I didn't answer?" The boys nodded slowly, their eyes never leaving his. "Well," Ethan said, his voice thickening with emotion, "the truth is, I do. I mean, I didn't know it before, not until recently. But it turns out I do have children." He paused, letting the words settle before gently adding, "And it's you two." The silence that followed felt eternal. Noah blinked, trying to make sense of what he'd heard. Caleb's mouth fell slightly open, confused but listening. Ethan leaned forward, placing a hand on the table between them, his voice softer now, almost reverent. "I'm your dad," he said. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't. But now that I do, now that I see you know you, I'm not going anywhere. Ever." Caleb looked at his brother, then back at Ethan. "Really?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded, eyes damp. "Really? From the moment I found out, my heart changed. You're my boys, and I love you." The room fell into a deep, almost sacred silence after Ethan's confession. Noah and Caleb sat frozen, their little hands resting on the edge of the coffee table, their eyes wide and unreadable. The weight of Ethan's words seemed to hang in the air like dust caught in a shaft of afternoon light, unmoving and suspended in time. Ethan didn't push, didn't say anything else. He simply waited, letting the boys process in their own time. He had no right to expect instant understanding, no expectation of forgiveness. He only knew that whatever came next, he had to face it with the same steadiness he wished he'd had a decade ago. Then, after what felt like hours compressed into seconds, Noah finally spoke. His voice was small, trembling just slightly, but there was a strength underneath a quiet plea wrapped in a question. "If you came back," he said, not looking directly at Ethan, but rather staring at a chipped spot on the wooden table between them, "would you stay this time?" The simplicity of the question cut through Ethan like a blade. He swallowed hard, throat tightening as he tried to speak through the storm of guilt and love rising inside him. "Yes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper at first, then stronger. "Yes, Noah, I'm staying. I know I don't deserve your trust yet. I know I missed so many years. But I'm here now, and I'm not leaving." Caleb still hadn't said a word, but his fingers had crept closer to Ethan's on the table, just enough for their hands to touch. It wasn't a hug, not even a full gesture, but it was something, a beginning. Noah finally looked up, his eyes shining, searching Ethan's face for any sign of dishonesty. Finding none, he gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. And in that silent agreement, that fragile thread of belief, Ethan felt something inside him begin to heal. Not all at once, but enough. Enough to stay. Ethan sat still, caught somewhere between breath and disbelief when Caleb, who had been quiet the entire time, finally spoke. His voice was soft but steady, the kind of voice that didn't ask for attention, but somehow drew it anyway. He looked directly at Ethan now, not with the wariness of a child unsure of a stranger, but with the calm certainty of someone who had already made up his mind. "Because we already chose you," Caleb said, his small hands resting on his lap, his gaze unwavering. "We chose you, the day you brought us hot chocolate." The words hung in the air like a warm blanket, surprising and grounding all at once. Ethan blinked, his throat tightening again, but this time from a different kind of emotion, a mixture of awe, gratitude, and something dangerously close to tears. He remembered that day vividly, the way the cold had clung to his coat, the way he'd walked toward the park bench with 2 cups and no expectations, how the children hadn't said much but didn't run either. That moment had felt like a fragile beginning, but now Caleb's words gave it meaning it hadn't had until now. To them, that cup of chocolate hadn't just been a kindness. It had been a sign, a gesture that meant someone saw them, someone stayed. Ethan had thought he was the one deciding to return, choosing to stay. But hearing Caleb now, he realized it had never been just his choice. These 2 boys, despite everything, had offered him something sacred, a second chance, not with words or grand forgiveness, but with the quiet decision to believe in him. And they'd made that choice long before he even knew they were his. His heart clenched with a mix of sorrow and hope as he reached across and gently took Caleb's hand. "Thank you," he whispered, voice raw. "I didn't know. But I won't forget. Not ever." The air smelled faintly of cinnamon and roasted vegetables as Rachel stepped gingerly through the front door, her coat still wrapped tightly around her frail frame, eyes scanning the small, worn space that had once felt too heavy to return to. But today it felt different, warmer somehow, lighter, like the weight had shifted from loneliness to something softer. Ethan was there right by her side, steadying her with a hand on her back, not rushing, just quietly present as always. The boys had spent the morning preparing for what they insisted had to be their first real Thanksgiving. And though the food was simple mashed potatoes that still had lumps, slightly overcooked turkey from a second-hand oven, and pumpkin pie from a store-bought crust, it was perfect in its imperfections. The apartment was decorated with hand-cut paper leaves Noah and Caleb had taped to the wall, each leaf scribbled with childish handwriting. Family Hope Chocolate Mama, and one written in bright orange marker just said, Ethan. They all sat down around the old wooden table that wobbled if you leaned on it too hard, and for a moment, nobody spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was full, a quiet acknowledgement that they had made it here together. Rachel looked from Ethan to the boys, her eyes shimmering not with pain, but something gentler, more astonished. Ethan raised a plastic cup of apple cider, clearing his throat. To second chances, he said, voice low but strong, and to this crazy, beautiful, unexpected family. The boys clinked their cups against his and giggled, and Rachel managed a teary smile. For the first time in a decade, she didn't feel like she was surviving alone. For the first time, they all belonged somewhere here, at this cluttered table, in this humble room, on this ordinary yet extraordinary Thanksgiving Day. Ethan didn't make a grand announcement, didn't hold a press conference or send out a company memo. Instead, he quietly signed the papers one Thursday afternoon in a small rented office in Hollow Creek's only law firm, transferring the majority of his shares to trusted partners, stepping back from the executive board and officially converting his role to remote consultancy. He didn't need the spotlight anymore. What he needed was to be near a little weathered house on Maple Street, where two boys waited each afternoon with stories about school and drawings of robots, and where a woman with tired eyes and fierce resilience slowly learned to lean on someone again. He rented a modest cottage 3 blocks away, close enough to walk over with groceries or show up unannounced, just to fix a loose cabinet door. His laptop sat on the kitchen table most mornings, where he took calls and replied to emails between making pancakes and helping Caleb with multiplication tables. The Ethan who had once lived in glass towers now learned to find meaning in simpler rituals, checking in on Rachel's medication schedule, showing up for parent-teacher meetings, helping the boys build a snowman, even when his fingers went numb. He had once chased legacy with a hunger that left everything else hollow, but now he saw something different in the slow, deliberate pace of life in Hollow Creek. The stillness here didn't scare him, it grounded him. And while the city had once defined his ambition, this quiet town began to define his presence. People noticed, of course, the way he moved without spectacle, the way he showed up day after day. But no one asked too many questions, because in a place like Hollow Creek, actions spoke louder than rumors. And Ethan's actions more than any press release told the world exactly what he had chosen, not just proximity, but permanence. Not just success, but a life that meant something. The snow had started falling softly by late afternoon, blanketing the yard in silence, as if the world itself had paused to listen. Inside the small living room, the warm glow of string lights wrapped imperfectly around the tree flickered against the windows. It wasn't the kind of tree Ethan used to see in glossy catalogs or corporate lobbies. It leaned slightly to the left. One side was a little bare, and the ornaments were a mix of handmade paper stars, unevenly painted wooden figures, and a few glittery bulbs from a dollar store. But to him, it was perfect. Caleb had climbed onto the couch earlier to place the star at the top, giggling, as Ethan pretended to wobble and nearly fall while lifting him. Noah had carefully laid out the presents, each one wrapped in brown paper and scribbled with their names in crooked marker letters. Rachel sat nearby in her favorite blanket, watching them with eyes that held quiet gratitude and something deeper peace maybe, or a trust slowly rebuilding. When the last ornament was hung, Ethan stepped back, brushing pine needles off his sweater, and looked down to find both boys standing beside him. Caleb reached up first, tugging gently at his sleeve, and without a word, wrapped his arms around Ethan's waist. Noah followed a second later, more hesitant, but just as sure, pressing his cheek against Ethan's side. For a moment, Ethan froze, caught off guard by the sheer weight of the moment, the warmth of two small bodies trusting him enough to draw near. Then he knelt slowly, wrapping his arms around them, both pulling them in close, as if anchoring himself to the ground. The lights flickered behind them. The smell of pine filled the room, and somewhere in the distance a carol played on an old radio. No words were needed. No declarations. Just the hush of falling snow. The steady rhythm of three hearts beating together, and the quiet truth that after everything, years, lost chances, missed pain endured, they had built something that mattered. Their first Christmas tree. Their first real Christmas. And in that embrace, beneath the crooked star and the blinking lights, Ethan knew he was home. At 17, Noah and Caleb stood in front of a modest community center, the very same one where years ago they'd received winter coats from a stranger and hot soup from a silent volunteer. Now, a crowd of children with bright eyes and empty arms buzzed around boxes filled with toys, and a long table offered warm meals prepared by local families. The sign above the door read, "Toys that Feed," the charity the boys had co-founded just 6 months prior. It had started as an idea scribbled on the back of a grocery receipt during a walk home after volunteering at a food bank, sparked by a conversation between the two brothers about how they never forgot the Christmas when Ethan brought over a single chocolate bar and helped put up their first tree. They didn't want to build something grand. They wanted to build something kind. The mission was simple. Every toy donated came with a warm meal for a child and their guardian. No forms, no questions. Just food and dignity. They'd used part of their college savings, Ethan's quiet support, and small grants to launch the pilot during the holiday season. It caught on faster than they imagined. Local restaurants offered food. Churches lent space. High school classmates became volunteers. And in the middle of it all, Caleb and Noah, taller now, more sure of themselves but still holding on to that same quiet softness, showed up every Saturday to unpack boxes, clean floors, and sit cross-legged beside children who reminded them of their younger selves. The initiative had now fed over 2,000 families and given away nearly 5,000 toys. When reporters asked why they did it, Noah simply said, "Because we remember what it felt like to be forgotten." And Caleb added, "And what it felt like to be chosen." What had once been a broken childhood now gave birth to something whole, not a grand foundation with marble floors, but a warm place filled with laughter, soup steam, and kindness that asked for nothing in return. Ethan watched from the back hands in his pockets, pride and love radiating quietly in his chest. His sons, no longer boys, had become the kind of men the world needed. On the small stage, draped with string lights and cardboard snowflakes, Noah adjusted the microphone, while Caleb stood beside him holding a worn, faded action figure in his hand, the same one that had been forgotten on a store shelf years ago. The audience of children, parents, volunteers, and local reporters grew quiet as Noah began, his voice steady but soft. This all started, he said, on a freezing winter afternoon, when a man named Ethan, just a stranger, then walked into a store and picked up the one toy nobody else had wanted, a scratched-up robot with a missing arm. Caleb lifted the toy slightly, and some in the audience chuckled. We didn't know it. Then Caleb continued, but that toy changed everything. That same night, Ethan knocked on our door. My mom was sick. We didn't have much. And he brought groceries, medicine, and this toy, just one. But that toy meant someone had seen us. Someone had remembered we existed. Noah looked at the crowd, his eyes locking with the children seated up front. That toy wasn't expensive. It wasn't shiny or new. But when he gave it to us, we felt just for a moment like the world hadn't forgotten about us. And that he paused was the first time we believed in hope that came wrapped in plastic and kindness. Caleb leaned in, his tone lighter, but sure. We never told him, but we named the robot Brave, because that's what it felt like to be brave enough to knock on a stranger's door and stay. The audience was still moved by the simple memory, the weight of it pressing gently on the holiday air. So when we started Toys That Feed, Noah added, we weren't just giving out gifts. We were passing forward the moment that saved our lives. A toy, a meal, a person who stayed. Ethan, standing at the back of the hall with his hands folded and eyes full, turned away briefly to wipe a tear. He hadn't known then that buying that forgotten toy would change 3 lives. And now, years later, that quiet act had lit 1,000 others. As the final applause from their story began to settle into a reverent hush, Noah and Caleb stood together under the stage lights, now not as children telling a tale, but as young men carrying a legacy. The old action figure rested between them on the podium, a quiet symbol of the life that had grown from its chipped plastic frame. Caleb took a breath, glancing once toward the back of the room where Ethan stood still quiet, his hand loosely curled by his side as if bracing against a wave of emotion. We've told you how it started. Caleb said, his voice steady, but we haven't yet said why it lasted. The room leaned in slightly, a subtle collective anticipation rising in the stillness. We know what it's like to be left behind, to be passed over, forgotten, invisible. For a long time it was just the 3 of us, me, Noah, and Mom. And then one day, someone showed up with groceries, with medicine, with a broken toy and no instructions. He didn't try to fix us, he just stayed. At first, we didn't know what to call him. He was just that man who helped. Then he was Uncle Ethan. Then one night he fell asleep on the couch after putting us to bed and making dinner because Mom was too sick, and I remember thinking, I don't care what his name is. He's ours. Noah took over softer now, his eyes bright with a deep calm. He taught us to ride bikes. He showed up to our school plays. He missed meetings to take us to the doctor. He burned dinner more times than we could count. But he was there. And not just in the easy moments, he stayed through the hard ones. Through the silences, the anger, the questions. He didn't have to. But he did. Caleb stepped forward, voice firm but full of warmth. And so tonight, as we stand here grateful, grown, and still learning, we want to say this aloud for everyone to hear. He paused, glancing once more at Ethan, who now had tears streaming freely down his cheeks. We love this man, not because he's our biological father, but because he chose to love us with action, not blood. In the end, this story isn't just about Ethan, Noah, and Caleb. It's about all of us. Anyone who's ever made a mistake, missed a chance, or felt it was too late to make things right. Life rarely offers perfect timing or clean beginnings. Sometimes the most powerful love stories don't start with fireworks, but with small repeated acts of showing up. Ethan didn't become a father through biology, he became one through presence. He chose to stay to fix broken toys and bruised hearts with the only tools he had: patience, consistency, and love. And in a world where people often measure relationships by blood or titles, this story reminds us that what truly defines family is not DNA, but devotion. It's a reminder that anyone can start over, not with grand gestures, but with steady, humble steps. If you've hurt someone, reach out. If you've been hurt, leave space for grace. If you're standing at the edge of a second chance, take it. You never know who's quietly hoping you'll stay this time. And if you're already showing up for someone quietly daily, thank you. You're doing holy work whether or not the world sees it. Real love is not loud, it's loyal. And that matters more than we know. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect: who have you shown up for today? Or who do you wish had stayed? Share your thoughts in the comments, we'd love to hear your story. Don't forget to save this video for when you need a reminder that love can heal, and subscribe to the channel for more real emotional stories that remind us all what truly matters.